about now? There we go. There we go. I was pushing the button down rather than sliding it. Could have been there all day doing that. Okay. Ooh, that seems loud. Okay, it'd be good to have your class manual in front of you. We'll be referencing that a couple times. It'd be good if you had a Bible within reach. It would be good if you had some notes. Hands up. Okay, Aaron, do you want to do the announcement now about the assignment? You're going to want to take this down. You're going to want to write this down. Probably. And right at the top of the page, there's another 10 possible topics for you. That's lesson 21. It's lesson 21 at the end, life work. This is a little complicated. The life work on this section goes on several pages because part of this is a sample paper. So it gets a little confusing about where 21 ends and where 23 starts. Because the life work section doesn't end until 62. Everything from page 59, actually, from page 60 to the end of 62, that's all the life work. Different, okay. Anyway, and Aaron, I don't know if you want to, don't want everybody doing Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance. Don't know if you want to try to split this up a little bit somehow. I'll let you deal with that. What was just... Okay. Tell you what you could do. You could take all of them, put them on a piece of paper, put them in a box, and you draw one, and that's yours. Okay? Who's got a good opening prayer? Anybody? Lee? Just real quick, some of you don't really know me. That's an Italian last name for those of you who find those sorts of things interesting. My father came from an immigrant family. He was born in the States, but his older brothers were born in Italy. So my family's not been here all that long. I've been married to Adele. Adele, put your hand up. For 45. Yeah, 46 this year. Yeah. We have two daughters, Rachel and Sarah. I was talking to Aaron months ago when we first started looking at this class. He says, is there anything there you'd be interested in teaching? So I started flipping through the pages, and it's like, oh, yeah, all that stuff on apologetics. How many of you are familiar with the term apologetics? Is that everybody? Not everybody. Can we make a better spot for these? You sure? Because there's two seats right here, and there's two seats right there. Okay. You think this will help? Does that help any? The next probably 5 weeks, I think it'll take 5 weeks, we're going to be looking at various aspects of the defense of the faith. Now, when we use the term apology, it's like, oh, I'm sorry. That's not what this is. This term, apology, comes from the Roman legal world. And if there was a trial, the apology was the portion where the defendant was able to defend themselves. They gave a defense and an explanation. So very early on, Christians in the Roman Empire engaged with the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world, all the polytheism, and started to explaining Christianity to a pagan world. And as a group, they're called the apologists. So it's a very broad category. It can cover a lot of different things, but we're going to be focusing, at least initially, on Scripture. Lesson 21. And go ahead and turn to page 56. I'm doing things in a different order. Now, you might be wondering, why should I listen to him? Who is he, and why should I listen to him? I got a Bible college degree. I got a BTH in Bible. I have a master's degree in Christian theology. I pastored for 13 years. I've studied apologetics for years, and I've taught apologetics in various places around the world. So when I saw this list come up on the index there, I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that. Yeah, let me do that. And Aaron graciously let me do that. Actually, he's really glad that he's not doing this. So here's the rules for the class. Questions are our friends. Your questions are our friends. Okay? I mean it. I don't want this to be a lecture class where I just talk and talk and talk and talk and you just keep writing things down. If you don't understand something, you have some insight, let's talk. Raise your hand. Let's share it. Let's explore this together. We're probably looking at 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks on apologetics, apologetics is defending and explaining the faith. Okay. So we're going to be looking at a couple weeks of the trustworthiness of the Bible. Very foundational issue for Christians. Sources of the original manuscripts for the books of the Bible. Where did this information come from? Why do we trust it? Why do we think we have the actual stories? Why do we think we know what Jesus actually said and actually did? And this is really, really important, because if we don't know, what are we doing right here? We're wasting our time. We're guessing. We're making stuff up on the fly. But if we've really got the words of Jesus, now we've got something we can really hang on to. So this is extremely important. Why do we believe what we believe? What's the evidence? So we're going to be looking at sources of manuscripts, the sources of the information. We'll be looking at the transmission of the text, which is the written words on the page. Like, once Mark wrote down his version of Jesus' life, what happened? It was copied. And then what? And then it was copied again. Here's the original. And we're clear out here 2,000 years later, and on the other side of the world. Why do we think we know what this was? We wouldn't even be able to identify an original. There'd be no way to identify it. It would just be words on a page. So you have all these copies, and then copies of copies, and copies of copies, for up until about the mid-1400s with the invention of the printing press. Everything was hand done. And every time, I don't know if you've ever tried to write down something by hand, long passages, it's really hard to stay focused. Picture scribes sitting for 6, 7, 8 hours a day, not at a nice table like that, sitting on a little teeny stool with their pad in front of them, inkwell beside them. There are manuscripts that have notes made by the copyist, by the scribes. The ink has frozen in the ink pot. I can't feel my hands. It's snowing outside. That sort of stuff. It said, being a scribe pushes your internal organs up into your lung. That sort of stuff. Really uncomfortable. Try that for hours and hours and hours and see how many mistakes you make. So the transmission, this process from the original transmission, generation, copy, more generation, copy. That's called the transmission of the text, which are the words on the page. So we're going to be looking at manuscripts. We're going to be looking at variants, where the manuscripts don't line up. What do they do with that? Because there's a whole bunch of variants. When you have thousands of handwritten copies, you're going to have thousands of variants. The number's actually a lot higher than that. You may have heard that on the news sometimes. There's more variants than there are words in the New Testament. Anybody ever hear that? Yeah, it's true. But you're going to find out why that doesn't really matter, because it sounds scary. We're going to look at the canon. Anybody familiar with the term canon? Why do we have the 27 books in the New Testament that we have? Why don't we have 28? Why don't we have 30? Why don't we have 20? How was that decision made? How were those chosen? Who made the decision? When was it made? Same thing. The Old Testament's a lot more complicated. We're going to spend most of our time looking at New Testament stuff because, first of all, that's what I really like, and I'm in charge. So there's also a lot more to work with on the New Testament. The Old Testament, the path through the Old Testament is really complicated. So we're going to be looking at text and variants. We're going to look at the canon. Ultimately, we'll look at other religions and cults. We're going to look at atheism versus theism. At that point, we're moving out of dealing with Bible. So how far Aaron will let me go, we'll see. But I'm expecting it'll take at least probably 5 weeks anyway. So I'll be here for at least 5 weeks. I'm going to Cuba 6 weeks from now. Let me ask you a question, and I want feedback on this. How many of you have a Bible that has a map in it? Why are there maps? What does that mean? I mean, I've got a copy of the Lord of the Rings, and there's a map in it. Is that Is that the same thing? There's a little dragon on it, and yep. Yeah. So you're reading the text. You're, you're reading. You're reading the text, and it says Jesus traveled from here, from Cana to wherever, and you flip to the map, and it gives you an idea of how far that is. But what's behind that? It's a real place. It's a real place. We're talking about history. Certain things are true. Certain things happened to certain people in certain situations. The Bible is a record of some of that. Some of the things that God did, the interaction with God and man, the Bible is a record of some of that. That makes it really, really valuable. But it was written, the Old Testament was written before the time of Jesus, was finally settled before the time of Jesus, so that's over 2,000 years. The New Testament is about 2,000 years old, and they're in different languages, and you're dealing with different cultures. There is a lot of opportunity to misunderstand things. So it takes some work. There's another question. This is in Luke's Gospel. Nativity stories. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This is chapter 2. This was the first registration when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Okay? So you've got Caesar Augustus mentioned and Quirinius, who's the governor of Syria, mentioned. Beginning of the next chapter. Jump forward now because you're now at the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius was tetrarch of Abilene. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. What is Luke doing? Why that level of detail? Who cares who was the ruler? What's he doing? Okay. But more specifically, okay, context, that's part of it. It's history. Right. So okay, you're saying historical data, historical detail makes it more likely to be true. Here's what's going on. He's giving you a date. This is how they dated things. They dated things from the local ruler or sometimes from a major event. There's a reference in the Old Testament about something happening so many years after the earthquake, which means everybody in that region remembered. That's like us. I remember back before COVID. You know, we're doing that with COVID, right? There's before COVID and during COVID, and then there's after COVID. So that was a major event. They're giving us dates. He's giving us dates. This is how they dated things. How many years into the reign of a local king? Look what he does in the 3rd chapter. Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod was tetrarch of Galilee. So Herod the Greatest died. His kingdom is divided up into 4 parts, and he lists the 4 parts. Then he gives the high priests. So he's giving us the Roman emperor, really big picture. He's giving us the rulers of all the sections around Israel. He names all 4 of them and where they were ruling. And he talks about the high priest Annas and Caiaphas who are ruling and functioning in Jerusalem. When you take all those people and look at their rule and reign, so to speak, it only gives you a couple-year window. He's not saying it was October 22nd. But he's for something 2,000 years ago, knowing within a year or two, it's pretty good. Pretty good. Again, why is he doing this? Can anybody explain to me what she's saying? Okay. 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 All right. 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 There's a meshing. I think is where you're going. Yeah. Lee. Okay. Lee. Yeah. You put that many details in that are verifiable, it's probably true. All right. Christianity is a historical religion. Some religions aren't historical. Um, some branches of Hinduism. Dates and people have nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing. It's not event driven. It's thought driven. It's concept driven. Christianity is based on certain events happening at a certain time, prophesied, and that gives them great meaning. So history becomes extremely important to Christians. Extremely important. So the questions we're going to be asking, and you should be asking, always asking, is this true? Not, do I like this? Does this fit with my lifestyle? That's not what you should be asking. The biggest question to ask is this true? Now, Christianity makes frankly, some pretty spectacular claims. That God became human. Didn't just look human. Flesh, meat, look, And the death of that one man paid for the sins of the entire past, present, and future human race. That's almost literally unbelievable. So it's going to take some pretty good evidence, and we've got it. Well, he said that's where faith comes in. Crazy faith. I would say no, not crazy. It's not crazy. Okay. You can make the case, and even people who are scientists, if you pin them down, you'll find out that they have faith in certain things. There are things they don't know, they can't prove, they have faith in them. So the question is, what do you have faith in? Who do you have faith in? So what do we assume about the Bible? We assume the source is God. We assume it is trustworthy and therefore has authority in our lives. You with me so far? Trustworthiness is a necessity for authority. Think about the life and miracles and teachings of Jesus. Did they really happen? Do we have the real story? That is an extremely important question. So this week, you should be at page 56 in your manual. I'm going to do things out of order from what's what's in the manual. Aaron gave me permission to do this any way I wanted to. I want to look at the authority of the Bible, various aspects of determining the authority of the Bible based on the trustworthiness of the Bible. Christianity rises or falls, lives or dies on the trustworthiness of Scripture. It's that simple. If it's true, it is amazing. It's the most important thing out there. If it's not true, we just need to go home because we're wasting our time. This is all a joke. So, there are two elements to trustworthiness of these ancient documents. Let's say that Jesus heals somebody. Mark writes it down. Or one of the other apostles, an eyewitness, writes it down. That's a very valuable document. You've got an eyewitness account of a miracle by an eyewitness. I mean, that's really good. So that's good for then. We're 2,000 years later. Remember the transmission? You've got to copy and then copy and copy and copy. What if mistakes creep in and then they multiply and then they multiply and every generation adds more and by the time you get 2,000 years out, the story doesn't bear any resemblance to what actually happened. There really was a miracle. Do we have anything to work with there? No. We don't have a trustworthy source anymore. The flip side is, what if somebody makes something up? What if Mark made up something that Jesus said or did? Just made it up. And it's written down, and it is perfectly preserved to this day. Do we have anything valuable? No. You have to have both of these. You have to have good content, solid content, good sources to begin with. Then that has to be transmitted faithfully over time and space, distance, we're on the other side of the world, to end up with anything that is trustworthy. Do you see that? One or the other is not good enough. If you just have one of those, you don't have anything you can trust. If you have both of these, now you've got something. Okay, we had a question. Yeah, she's talking about the telephone game. Now, the whole telephone game, and that's been tossed out by critics of the Bible for years as, well, that's, it was just handed down, this person told this person about Jesus, and that the story gets changed a little bit, and they tell somebody else. The reason the telephone game model doesn't work with this sort of thing is, once you write something down, a lot of the creep, a lot of the modifications of the story disappear. Also, if you have, in the case of things that were written down about Jesus, you have multiple people that are writing the same thing down. You have multiple people that heard him not once, not twice, but probably hundreds of times. His disciples heard him preach and teach hundreds of times. They knew his material. That combination cuts out the whole telephone game, because I can check. If you get 4 or 5 of the apostles together, they can talk about Jesus' teaching. Between them, they know it. They know it all. The chances of there being creep becomes much, much less. Now, the transmission of the text, and I'm not going to spend any time on that today because in about 2 weeks we're going to spend probably half of an evening on this. You need to understand why you have what are called variants. Every time one manuscript is different from another one. It's called a variant. Why the total number of variants basically doesn't even matter. You'll see it in the news. Oh, there's over 100,000 variants. There's more variants than there are the words in the New Testament. That sounds like every single word in the New Testament is compromised, right? That's sort of the implication. That is not true. It's not even remotely true. So we're going to look at that. But what I want you to get stuck in your head right now is, for us to have a trustworthy text, for us to have an authoritative Bible, we have to have both of these. So we're going to look at these separately. We're going to look at this one next week, and that one's probably the following week. We're going to kind of pull all this together. Questions? Mm-hmm. Right. See, and there are a couple references in the manual where he talks about trusting something because it was copied carefully. That doesn't address this issue. It assumes this issue, that we have trustworthy content. So he's saying, the way it's stated, it sounds like all the accuracy depends on the transmission, and that's not true. You have to have good material to start with to have something worth transmitting. You see the balance. So, we're going to be looking at the Old Testament and the New Testament. They are very, very different. We lump them all together and call that collection the Bible. But in reality, what we have are two libraries. The writings that we call, the collection of writings that we call the Old Testament, are writings that are associated with the Old Covenant. Directly or indirectly, everything in the Old Testament is tied to the covenant with Moses. That is the focal point of the Old Testament. The Exodus was to do what? Get them out of Egypt and just let them run free? No. What was it? He is pulling them out because they're his people. He's rescuing them from slavery to make them his own people and enter into a very special relationship with them. And that all works through Moses and the Ten Commandments and Mount Sinai and the Passover, all that. That whole package. That's the covenant. That is the focal point of the entire Old Testament. It is a much, much broader collection of literature than the New Testament is. The Old Covenant, the writings of the Old Testament have law, not just religious law. What to do if somebody commits murder? We're talking about like case law, capital, summary punishment, capital executions. If he does this, then you're to kill him. So, what we call the Old Testament is, almost in a nutshell, almost like the framework of their entire society, not just their religion. What do you do with mildew? Ceremonial. How many of you just love the parts about mildew? I just go back and read them over and over again. I made one of those my life verse one year. You don't have anything like that in the New Testament. Nothing like that. Because the New Testament does not function for Christians the way the Old Covenant, for what the Old Covenant is to Jews. These are two different worlds. These are two different worlds. So, this is roughly 4 times as long as that, as far as just number of words, just material. This has forms of literature in it that the New Covenant doesn't have. This has far more prophecy, a lot more history. The legal stuff goes on and on and on and on. All the stuff about the priesthood and all that stuff, none of that's in the New Testament. None of that's in the New Covenant, the New Testament, the collection. So they're functioning very, very differently. The Old Covenant did not represent to Jews what the New Covenant represents to us. It was far broader than that. It controlled and shaped their entire existence. This one is about Moses, the law. What's this about? A person. And not just any person. The Christ, the anointed one, the promised anointed one. And everything about the New Testament is about that, about him. It's either about him or it's the recollections and the teachings of his closest apostles. That's the entire New Testament. That's it. Now, we need to understand the time frame. Let's see, how do I want to do this? I got to squeeze in a couple more. This is all BC. The events of the Old Testament start where? In the beginning. Out of sight, this direction. We don't know. We don't know how far that is. When you hit this point, 2000, here, this is Abraham. This is David. This is David's time. This is the Assyrian. Anybody ever hear of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? That's here, 721. Babylon carries off the southern kingdom when? About here. The last prophet writes about here, Malachi. About 400. Most of the Old Testament, the writings of Moses, start where? When would he have written it? It's about, you're close, 13 to 1400, somewhere in there. So we got the writings. It's all written here, and it disappears. The actual events disappear off the chart this direction. You see what I'm trying to? The New Testament is right here. All of it. The events and the writing of it. So if Moses is writing here at 1300, 1400 BC, and he's writing about something that happened thousands of years before, that's a huge gap between event and recording. What do we have here with the New Testament? It's all within 100 years. On this kind of timeline, that's like, Gerald just went, it's like yesterday. The distance between the event And when it was recorded, when you're talking about historical events, is extremely important because why? Accuracy. Who was around to see it? Do we have eyewitnesses? That's what you want. You want eyewitnesses. You know? So these two collections are completely different. But this one is the foundation for that one. This is Act 1 of a two-part play, so to speak. This is a necessity. Very complicated, very messy. But we talk about the Bible. The Bible says. The Bible doesn't say anything. The authors of these books, through the Holy Spirit, speaks. The Bible's a library. You need to think about that. You walk through the front door of the library. If you turn to the right, you're into the collection of literature dealing with the New Covenant and Jesus. If you walk into the front door and you turn to the left, you're into the wing of the Old Covenant. And you're in the realm of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. This is a difficult concept for people who've been raised with the Bible. Well, the Bible. Anybody ever hear Billy Graham preach? The Bible says. The Bible's only important because it has this information in it. This information is not important because it's in the Bible. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's in the Bible because it's important. It's a collection of important documents. And they were assembled. And there were other things that could have been put in there. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about the canon. So this is a very, very broad, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, very broad collection, both by topic and by chronology, meaning passage of time, and by the different kinds of literature that are in it. Whereas this is much more focused, much shorter, much more focused, doesn't have the variety of literature in it. So how these two collections formed is very different. Parts of this, we're not even sure where the books came from. Not even sure who the authors are. The history of this covenant, this testament, is a lot more complicated than the New Testament. A lot more complicated. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that because you end up with a lot of questions. Now, if you're really interested, I'm going to be bringing in some books about the sources of the Old Testament documents and the Old Testament canon. And I'll loan them to you. You have to promise right hand to God you'll bring them back. But if you really want to take a deep dive, I've got the books for it. Okay, are there any questions at this point before I erase this? Okay. Yeah, who wrote Job? It's about Job. Who wrote it? No. I don't think there's any knowledge of who wrote Esther. The New Testament, not clear on Hebrews. That's the one. Yeah. So anyway, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you want to take a really deep dive into the Old Testament, the canon and everything. I've got books for that if you want to follow that. Anyway, what I'm trying to get stuck in your head is that the Old Covenant and the Old Testament, very, very different collection of literature than our New Testament. Now, talk about history. If stories that supposedly took place in the past are true, you would expect them to line up with other historical events of the time. You'd expect them to line up geographically. You'd expect if they mentioned a ruler or whatever, it would be appropriate. That king, yes, that king was ruling during that time. Those would be signs of authenticity. So when we look at the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, I'm going to just say Old Testament. I want to look at a couple opportunities or a couple examples of evidence for it being authentic. Anybody ever hear of Sodom and Gomorrah? Okay, what's it famous for? Without getting their children present. Sin. And being spectacularly destroyed for their sin. It has long been held, you've got like the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea. It's long been held that Sodom and or Gomorrah were down here. There are ruins visible there. There are asphalt pits in the area. It kind of looks like the brimstone raining out of the sky and all that. Well, they've been doing excavations down here, and something doesn't add up. These settlements aren't nearly big enough to be the Sodom and Gomorrah mentioned in the Old Testament. These were fairly large cities. They were major cities called the cities of the plains. So somebody was looking at that going, something's not fitting. Something's not fitting. So for centuries, it's been assumed this is the authentic site. Now you've got reason to go, wait a minute. And an archaeologist opened the Bible and looked in the story of Abraham. It says, and Abraham walked over to a certain spot, and he looked to the east at Sodom and Gomorrah. He was standing, I think about like here. This would have been southeast. Just that one simple thing. The guy looked at it and went, if this book is accurate, this is not Sodom and Gomorrah. We need to look over here somewhere. And they're digging there right now. Because there are at least some archaeologists are quite convinced this isn't it. And the point is, that's how seriously they take the Bible as a historical document. It says he looked east to Sodom and Gomorrah. Therefore, Sodom and Gomorrah must be east. Let's go look over there. And they found cities, and they're excavating them right now. Now, there's a number of them, and it's not clear yet what all they're going to find. But archaeologists trust the Old Testament. It has been proven over and over and over again to be essentially historically accurate. Yeah. Yeah, so they found another location that matches, and it's where it's supposed to be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it was destroyed by fire. Yeah. Anybody ever hear of Hittites? Remember the story of King David, and the guys are out at war, and he sees a woman bathing on the roof, Does she know that the king's watching her? Maybe. Her husband was Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men. Think like commando. Think like commando guys, special forces guys. That's who this guy was. He was a Hittite. The Hittites are mentioned several places in the Old Testament. And for many centuries, they were completely unknown anywhere else. And critics of the Bible said, well, it's obviously made up. These are just fables. These are just stories. This isn't history. Here's an entire people group. But they don't appear anywhere else. If the Hittites were real, where are all the Hittites? And then somebody excavates, and I think they're still excavating it, the capital city in Turkey of the Hittite Empire. It was a big league empire. It was the chief rival of Egypt at its peak under Ramses II. That's how big the Hittite Empire was and how powerful it was. And its reach went down almost to Egypt. And Israel was in like the buffer zone between the two of them. So Israel had like Hittites, So suddenly we went from the whole thing's a fable, the whole thing's made up. There are no Hittites. This is ridiculous. This is like a fairy tale to, now there's an entire branch of archaeology that studies the Hittites and the Hittite Empire. So not only do you have people that are Hittites and you have a race that are Hittites, you've got an empire that's Hittite. And the Bible, again, proves itself to be a trustworthy document. Now, the people who made fun of it centuries ago are dead. So, hold on a second. Am I catching on my collar? Why is it? Let me try that. Okay. Questions or comments on that? History. The Hittites are history. They're part of Israel's history. These are 3 successive empires in the Middle East. They appear in the Bible. This is the empire that carried off the northern kingdoms, the 10 northern tribes, 721. This, 586. And this is about 500. This is the empire that let them go back. So here you have the captivity, the Babylonian captivity, and here you have a change in world empires, and a king with a different name lets them go back. These are all in the Bible, but these are all well-known empires in world history. They're not made up. Let's talk about things matching up. The period of their practices, for instance, Babylon deporting large numbers of people, that was their practice. It wasn't just Israel. They moved people all over the place. They took the Israelites and put them over here. They put those people from here down here. They put people over here to break their sense of their connection with their homeland. That was Babylonian polity. That's how they handled it. Media Persia didn't have that polity. So when Nehemiah goes to the king and goes, "Hey, could we go back?" He's like, "Oh, sure. How much you need? When? How long will you be gone?" They didn't have that policy. The biblical story lines up with what is known about these 3 world empires where they interacted with Israel. What does that say? Accuracy. Historical. When you read the biblical text, you're reading history. Now, it's history from Israel's standpoint. That's their perspective. That's the only way they can view it, about them being carried off. I mean, Daniel and Babylon, all that, about the idol worship and all that stuff, all the stuff that plagued them, that all lines up. And all that says what? True. It all says true. Questions or comments? Why are these examples important to us as we consider whether the Bible is trustworthy? What do these examples say to us? Mm-hmm. there were prophecies about Israel being carried off, and it came to pass. What do these say? These examples I just gave you, what do they say to you about the Old Testament? About the Old Testament collection of literature, 39 works. What is it? What do these say about that? They're historically accurate. They're true, which means they're trustworthy, which means there's authority. They accurately represent God's, in the case of where God gives his word, we have accurate representation of that. We have accurate representation of God's dealing with his people, the people that he rescued out of Egypt. Now let's think about the New Testament. Jesus healed a man at the pool of Siloam. John's gospel records that, just in passing, that it had 5 porches. I think some translations say porticos. Pool of Siloam, 5 porches. That had been buried for over a millennium until it was excavated, I think this century. No, 20th century. They got down. It's way below street level now. You look down. You look from street level. You look down probably 20 feet at least down to the pool of Siloam. And you know what they found? They found the foundations for the posts for 5 porches. So what does that mean? It was a real place. John was familiar with it. Why? Somebody from outside of town wouldn't have known that little detail just in passing. And it has 5 porches. John was familiar with it, and just happened to mention that. What does that do to our trust in John's writings? It should elevate it. He was right about this one minor point that is unusual and verifiable. Who can tell me, what do you know about Pontius Pilate? Where does he fit in the New Testament? Not all at once. Don't push. Where does he fit in the story? The whole New Testament's about Jesus. Where does Pontius Pilate fit in the Jesus story? Clear at the end. Yes. He's the one who ultimately, remember, he washed his hands? He said, if you want him crucified, you take care of that. I wash my hands of this, meaning he was saying he's not guilty as far as I'm concerned, and you're not going to stick his death on me. That Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate's headquarters was up on the sea, up on the Sea of the Mediterranean, in a city called Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the water, Caesarea on the ocean. There's a huge amphitheater there. It's one of the best in the ancient world. And when it was being partially restored by an Italian team in, I think it was 1960, 61, something like that, they were rebuilding a section of the staircase, and they found a plaque, a stone plaque with Pontius Pilate's name engraved on it, like chiseled into it, buried. Sometime in the past, there had been a repair done, and that piece of stone partially broke on one side. They used it to kind of prop up a section of stairs. And so we have a physical, in this case archaeologically found, absolute positive identification of Pontius Pilate. There really was a Pontius Pilate. He's known from other writings, but there's a physical representation exactly where you would expect it to be, at his palace. The time period's right. The name is right. All the circumstances are right. So what does that do to our trust in the New Testament? It's like, okay, there's another one. There's another thing that checks out. Read this earlier. Quirinius, the governor of Syria. He is a known Roman, not politician, ruler. He's not just known in the Bible. There's a lot known about him and about his history. But he's mentioned in the first part of Luke. It gives us a date, and it fits. Syria, you have the Roman Empire, and the emperor was over that. Syria was a section, administrative section that included Israel and included Phoenicia. He was the governor of that. He would have been based in Damascus, I believe. So he appears outside of the New Testament, in the right location, in the right position, at the right time. What does that do to our trust in the New Testament? Yeah. It's not made up. You don't get stuff like that when people make things up. There's too many things that fit like this. And this, I could go on for 2 or 3 hours easily. The Bible it's unbelievable how many things have been found, how many things have turned up. Okay, there was a hand up. Did I see a hand up? No? Yeah. Yeah, it's just one more. It's just one more. You know, if you need one more, if you need 10 more, I've got them. How many does it take? Why are these examples important to us as we consider the trustworthiness of the New Testament? What do they say? Solid. You want something solid, something trustworthy. Trustworthy. It is worthy of your trust. Yeah, and always has been. There's lots of skeptics. There's always somebody. But every time, people keep saying, these skeptics keep saying, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about the Hittites? There's no Hittites. Oh, wait, look, we just found the Hittites. Oh, okay, never mind. Well, look, now there's none. What do they do? Does that change their mind? Did anybody get saved because of that? Probably not. There's a determination in some people to not believe it because they don't want it to be true, because then they would be responsible. A friend of mine was we're going to wrap up with this. A friend of mine was in graduate school. He was doing his doctorate in chemistry. Very sharp guy at Virginia Tech in Virginia. And the professor who was overseeing it was a very, very well-known high-level chemistry guy. And my friend Tony was like, he's studying basically the chemistry of life. He says, this is way, way too complicated for this to have happened. It's ridiculous how complicated this is. There is no such thing as simple life. He and another one of the graduate students, who was a Muslim, interestingly enough, went to the professor and said, can we talk to you for a minute? It's like, you in your classes and everything, you're teaching evolution. But you know it's not true. You know it can't be true. We know it can't be true. The chemistry of life is too complicated. It could not possibly have happened. Why are you still teaching evolution? And he said, because the alternative is unacceptable. He knew it wasn't true, but he did not want to face a creator. So Paul in the first part of Romans talks about people who willingly pervert the truth. That's one of those guys. There is an abundance of evidence that the New Testament documents and the Old Testament documents, particularly the New Testament, are highly reliable. But once you reach that point, you have to get to the point where you go, okay, and what does that mean to me? That's all very good for what happened 2,000 years ago. What does it mean to me now? And some people won't take that step. They'll avoid that step. Now, for anybody who's really interested in archaeology or evidence of that sort of thing, Here's the archaeology and the New Testament, loaded with really interesting pictures, articles about all kinds of stuff out of the New Testament. Just a few of the things I touched on and a whole bunch more. It's here for you to look at. You can borrow it if you promise right hand to God, and I'll take your name. And this is the Archaeological Study Bible. And you can just open it anywhere and find amazing stuff about archaeology and the culture of the day, from everything in the Old Testament, New Testament. These will be up here, and you can have a look at them. I'll be bringing in other books later about the canon, the formation of the Old Testament canon, New Testament canon. I'll be bringing in some books about the text of the New Testament, all the thing about variants and all that. So for those of you who are interested, I've got some resources for you. So, is there a last question? He said the alternative. The alternative is unacceptable. The alternative to evolution, the alternative to atheism is unacceptable. Okay, last question, comment? Yeah, poorly executed. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, that's actually dealing with New Testament stuff. I'm not sure how it ended up right there. It's at the bottom of the section on the Old Testament. That has to do with texts. Numbers of manuscripts. Yeah, page 54. Okay, page 54, and it says there's author, Homer, Plato, Julius Caesar. Right, those are examples of ancient authors and ancient works, and showing how far away from when they were written do we have a copy, and how few there are. And then at the bottom it gives the New Testament. Yes, that will be covered. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that chart because that chart's, you're looking at it. That is the New Testament. Somebody said it's an embarrassment of riches. There are over 5,000 New Testament documents in Greek, and I think that chart gives there's several other languages. The number goes up over, I think, 20,000 ancient documents that attest to the New Testament. So the textual part of it, meaning the words on the page, an actual document, written document, is overwhelming, the amount of material the New Testament has compared to, and those are big leaguers. Plato. Okay, last comment, question? Okay, so the next week we will look at the sources. We'll look at some of the sources, particularly the New Testament.